tell Hull that this is the first time in my service to the government that I have ever asked for a meeting due to a personal matter, one regarding my people. If I do not get the meeting as requested, my resignation will be on Mr. Roosevelt's desk in the morning. I want to say to you, friends, that the Jewish community in Palestine is going to fight to the very end. If we have arms to fight with, we will fight with those, and if not, we will fight with stones in our hands. Europe was quite devastated by 1918. It had seen combat backwards and forwards, revolutions, the collapse of the Central Powers, massive population transfers. Empires had fallen, the Russian, the German, the Ottoman, although perhaps no place was this more evident than in Galicia, which was formerly part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and was about to be recreated as southern Poland.
Welcome to History for the Curious. I'm Menno Reisner, and I host the internationally renowned lecturer, dynamic historian and tour guide, Rabbi Aubrey Hirsch. Experience our history, confront dilemmas, and reveal the untold stories of 3,000 years of Jewish heritage, from Paris to Cairo, from the Russian Tsar to Maimonides, and from the Sinai Revelation to the French Revolution. Join the fastest growing Jewish history podcast in the world by subscribing to this channel and discovering the events that have shaped us into who we are today. Rabbi Hirsch, welcome back. Hope you had a lovely Yom Tov, and welcome back to all the listeners. We see from the feedback that a lot of you have managed to catch up on older episodes, and thank you for sending in your questions, your feedback, your concerns, your suggestions. They're all very much appreciated. This week is a podcast special. We all know you like a special, and it's titled The Greatest Fundraisers in Jewish History. Quite an unusual episode, quite a curious episode. Possibly our listeners can guess why, but Rabbi Hirsch, what's this one about?
Yes, we're going to explore landmark moments in fundraising history, and even though all four occurred within the 20th century, 3 of the 4 will be unknown to almost all of our audience, although by way of introduction I will reserve the right to define fundraisers as referring to people, or to events, or to campaigns. And we will also look at some of the more unusual halachic scenarios and an actual case in Besdin. And we'll start with the photo we posted on the JLE website today, which takes us back to a chilly evening in December 1921, where history was made at the famous Drake Hotel in Chicago. There was a grand gathering of 800 wealthy individuals, dressed to the hilt, yet, despite the elegance, there was one thing missing to such a degree that it would ignite a wave of generosity from the wealthy attendees. They had gathered for a fundraising event which was orchestrated by Jacob Lowe, and the catalyst was really the First World War. And because although in comparison the Second World War caused far greater damage and is also far more documented, Europe was quite devastated by 1918. It had seen combat backwards and forwards, revolutions, the collapse of the Central Powers, massive population transfers. Empires had fallen, the Russian, the German, the Ottoman, although perhaps no place was this more evident than in Galicia, which was formerly part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and was about to be recreated as southern Poland. There were thousands of peoples who'd been exiled from their houses and cities, thousands of orphans, and many who needed medical care. Now, in 1914, there was an American organization called The Joint, which brought together a number of different Jewish refugee aid programs. And after the First World War, they sent a mission to Eastern Europe, and the report back spoke of the extreme need for immediate help, for hospitals, for housing, for soup kitchens. People were starving. And in fact, in the decade after World War I, the JDC became the primary agency for overseas relief for Jews. This Jacob Lowe was living in Chicago, and he felt that the Jews of Chicago were not doing enough. So he came up with an idea. he invited the leading Jews of the city to a dinner. And as the last of them entered the grand ballroom, the doors were locked. The invitees were obviously expecting to be wined and dined, but then he began speaking and said, "For so many of us to dine in this place, the cost would be $3,500, which is about $70,000 in today's world, which would be an unwarranted extravagance in the face of starving Europe. It would be a crime. What right do we have to spend on ourselves money which is raised for others, and in order to save you're being brought to a foodless banquet?" And the guests looked around at the table, and indeed, with the exception of some candles, the tables were bare. And their bewilderment is captured in the camera's photo. It was a powerful way to remind attendees of those who'd been impacted by the war and poverty, and the evening turned out to be a great success. The proceeds were sent, and it was in excess of what was expected.
Wow. Were fundraising dinners a thing already?
Yes, for instance, for Palestine, that did exist, but you didn't have central organisations as we do today. So it was more diluted.
Right.
So that's number one. The next two on the list are individuals. Reb Elia Chaim Meisels of Lodz, who was born just over 200 years ago in 1821 near Vilna. He came from a very distinguished family. He was named Eliyahu after the Vilna Gaon and Chaim after Reb Chaim of Volozhin. He was Rov of a number of different locations, but he is identified with Lodz because he was the rabbi there for almost 40 years until his death in 1912. Nowadays, Lodz is the second or third largest city in Poland, but it happened almost overnight. In numbers, in 1793, there were 190 people in total living in Lodz. It was a village. 11 of them were Jewish. 100 years later, there were 300,000 people, 98,000 Jews. So when Reb Elia came, he found a city, but one that had almost no infrastructure. It was in need of many institutions, especially for the less fortunate, which was very common in Lodz because Lodz was a manufacturing town, cotton mills, factories, with a population that was almost sort of completely factory workers, and this is obviously before the age of workers' rights.
So it doesn't sound like he was trying to get funds to existing charities. He's trying to completely recreate or create an infrastructure.
He has to map, he has to undertake an entire city's needs, and then fundraise. And there's a huge divide back then between the factory owners and the factory workers. Many of the owners were, in fact, Jewish. To this day, there is a factory, nowadays it's just empty buildings, which is almost 600 meters in length. So he built orphanages, schools, hospitals. He created welfare. That's besides, for obviously, the standard religious buildings, shuls, mikvahs. And he continues this until he's 90 years old. He gave away every penny, continuously borrowing. Famously, to illustrate to what degree, he was once offered the rabbinate of Warsaw, which was home to hundreds of thousands of Jews and was the largest kehillah in Europe. But he turned it down, and he said, "When I was the rabbi of Prazan, I knew I could borrow money for the poor because once it got out of hand, a bigger city would pay up my debts in order to acquire me as their rabbi." And that's what happened. And I moved to Lomzha. I did the same thing in Lomzha, but this time my debts were 6,000 rubles, not 3,000. So it took Lodz to bail me out. But if I moved to Warsaw and acquired debts there, which city would be able to pay off those debts? So I can't afford to go to Warsaw.
Was this said tongue-in-cheek or?
Not really. He literally gave away everything, and there's no one he wouldn't help, irrespective of background, Jews, non-Jews. And he was helped in this matter by the unusual fact that for a Talmud Chacham of note, he spoke Russian. And as you can imagine, in the late 1890s, the early 20th century, there were a lot of Jewish Bundists, socialists who made up the Jews, the working class Jews of Lodz, most of whom we can safely assume were not shul goers. Yet he still included them as part of his constituency. Now, normally, when you get a sort of social action type of Rov, that's his skill set. But Reb Elio Chaim was respected as a Talmud Chacham, both by Litvaks and Hasidim. I mean, consider the fact that Lodz was a Hasidic Kehillah, and he was a Litvak. But the Sfas Emes encouraged his candidacy. And Reb Elio Chaim once met up with Reb Chaim Moshe Grudzinski, who showed him his own sefer and asked Reb Elio, "Where's your sefer?" Knowing that Reb Elio was, an accomplished Talmud Chacham. So Reb Elio took out a book that held all the debts that he had accrued on behalf of tzedakos, all the orphans, all the widows, all the institutions. And Reb Chaim agreed that this was far greater than any sefer that he could have written. Although, having said that, Reb Chaim Ozer had volumes of his own that he could have written in terms of tzedakah and communal responsibility, especially after World War II started, because he was the sole responsible authority for all the yeshivas in Lithuania, and he had cancer, from which he died not long afterwards. Now, for Reb Elio Chaim, perhaps because of how much he put himself out there for the people of the city of Lodz, his grave, his matzeva, is still there in Lodz, even though much of the cemetery was destroyed by the Nazis. Very famously, this story, which occurs during a particularly freezing winter, he goes to visit one of the prominent members of his community, Rav Yitzchok Poznansky, who served as the president of the community council. He's got a coat and a scarf, and the rabbi approaches the banker's mansion and he knocks on his door. The butler opens the door, he sees Rav Meidel standing there and he invites him in. And Rav Meidel says, "No, it's not necessary. Just tell Rav Yitzchok to come and see me." So the banker hears that the Rav is waiting, and he comes in his evening jacket to say hello. He sees the rabbi standing there in the frigid weather, and he says, "Rabbi, please come inside, I'll get you a hot tea." "No, what for? I'm not going to be long. All I need to say, I can say in a moment. And anyway, why should I dirty your home with my snow-covered boots?" Okay, so Rav Elio Chaim starts talking. And soon, Rav Yitzchok doesn't know what to do because he's freezing and the rabbi doesn't want to come in. But after a few minutes he says, "Please, Rabbi, I don't know about you, I'm freezing. I don't mind if your boots are wet. Just come in." The rabbi doesn't move. He starts talking about the plight of some of the unfortunate members of the community, and this banker is freezing. 5 minutes later, he says, "Rabbi, just tell me what you need. I'll give you whatever you want. Just come inside." And now Rav Elio Chaim comes in. He comes into the man's home, and he follows him to the living room where there's a blazing fire. And he says, "I need firewood for 50 families this winter." "No problem. But just one question. Why did we have the conversation outdoors?" So Rav Elio Chaim says, "I know you give, but I wanted you to understand what these poor people are going through. 5 minutes in the freezing cold would give you a different perspective than just me asking while in the warmth of your fireplace. It's a great story. It's a true story, but you need to go to Lodz to appreciate it, because I take groups to see his palace to understand the story in situ. You can still see it. It's still there. It's a huge palace, maybe 100 rooms. He created pikchus, an intelligence in how to go about tzedakah. And he was Moshe Nefesh for the klal, especially those who could not defend themselves, because tzedakah means helping the unfortunates. In 1894, there was a cholera plague that broke out in Lodz, and there were many victims, and the Rav spent enormous amounts of energy and time on it. He didn't differentiate between Jews and non-Jews. He visited the Jewish hospital on numerous occasions, and eventually the plague was defeated, and his Mesiras Nefesh in this case was noted to such a degree that the governor, the local governor of the area, mentioned it to the Russian government in St. Petersburg, who in recognition sent him a sword made out of gold with a message of thanks from the Tsarist government. And on a personal level, he prevented women being sold into white slavery, and he dealt with the micro as the macro. He was once visited by a poor woman who said that her daughter is supposed to get married. Her husband had died suddenly. She doesn't have any money to pay a dowry. So Rabbi Chaim doesn't have any money, any funds, So he goes into the room next door. He comes back with his silver candlesticks, and she refuses to take them. So he says, I am the Rav of this town. I order you to take them. Don't sell them. Give them to the pawnbroker's Lombard. Give me the receipt, and I'll eventually redeem it. And when his wife came to look for the candlesticks that Erev Shabbos, he said it's better that we use potatoes in which to light the candles and provide for those who need it. So he was a leader in Stocker. He had foresight, he was courageous, he was personally involved, hospitals, army issues, pogroms, abandoned kids, non-Jews came to him for advice. And despite the fact that he often went to non-Jewish authorities with requests, he was respected by them. And as I mentioned, he worked until the age of 90. There were tens of thousands of people at his funeral from all walks of life. You can see photos of it. Rabbonim, irreligious Jewish socialists, millionaires, paupers. Every factory was closed in Lodz when he was buried. And he exemplifies Midas Hanadivus, being a real donor, which doesn't just mean that I give. It's about what happens to the individual. If they empathize with the cause, with the person to which they give, if they feel the pain, if they also understand that the resources that they have been given by Hashem, then they extend themselves, they become a nadvan. It's not the amount, it's the transformation that happens to them through this activity.
That's exactly what a Baal Stocker is. Baal means an owner that not only gives, but he feels. He feels the responsibility of giving. I think, Rabbi Hirsch, we should probably explain to the listeners, although some of the eagle-eared ones might have guessed from the special fundraising episodes, that this Motzei Shabbos will be starting a fundraiser as part of a larger J-Lee fundraiser, but this there'll be a link for a History for the Curious page, and we plan on literally doubling, probably tripling, and hopefully more, our listener audience over the next 12 months. We've had, I sound like a broken record talking about our feedback, but I want listeners to know what sort of impact it's having and to be able to be a part of it. We'll be investing in social media and in a website to enable more and more Jews around the world to be able to access it in. You might take for granted that you listen to it every week, but not everyone has had the privilege of being able to discover it. And this is a unique opportunity that doesn't come around very often to be a part.
And in fact, for the opportunity to introduce one of our podcasts live, so to speak, well, stay tuned until the end of our podcast.
You didn't mention that.
Yes, for further details. Okay, number 3 on our list is Rav Yosef Shlomo Kahneman, known as the Ponevezher Rav. Now, there is a story which I heard 4 years ago from Jackie Levison, who was extremely close to the Ponevezher Rav, which he heard directly from the Rav. The first major Rabbanus that he had was in a place called Vids, which is northern Lithuania, during the First World War. The town had been overrun by the Germans, and there was a prisoner of war camp where Russian soldiers were being kept, which included 900 Jewish prisoners, and they were being given absolute starvation rations. The Ponevezher Rav went to the military commander of the camp and asked him why he's dealing with the prisoners in this way, and he answered, well, we're quite happy for them to die in captivity because we have nowhere to put them. So the Ponevezher Rav made the acquaintance of the civil commander of the city, and he played chess with him every night. And the Ponevezher Rav was a person who was living in a world of Torah, and he made time to play chess. One night, the civil commander said to him, do you know anyone in the lumber industry, somebody who knows about forestry, cutting down trees? And the Ponevezher Rav says, yeah, I know someone, but he's got no way of transporting his tools, he's got no horse, no wagons, they've all been taken as war materials. And the commander says, well, okay, bring him to me. So Ponevezher Rav brings this Jew to see the commander the next night, and the German civil commander says, I need the lumber of the forests in this area, surrounding the town, to be cut down and transported back to Germany, because there's a great need for lumber, there's a war going on, and if we do that, we can all make a lot of money. I'll take a third, you'll take a third, and the rabbi will take a third. And that's what happened. And every so often the Ponovicherov would come round and take his cut. And then he would go personally to this prisoner of war camp. He would bribe the guards and each time would bring out a few Jewish prisoners. He spent all of his money that he made on this deal and brought out every single one of the Jewish prisoners of war as a result. And obviously, had he been caught helping prisoners to escape during a war, this is treason, and it would have been the death penalty. You know, his friendship with the civil commander wouldn't have helped him. But he was a person who couldn't see another Jew in need and not help them. He then became the Rov in Ponovich, the town in Lithuania for many years. And then when the war broke out, he travelled to arrange an escape route for the community. Unfortunately, he was too late, and the entire kehillah and his whole family, except for one son, were murdered in the Holocaust, and everything he'd built up, everything he cherished, was destroyed. So he came to Bnei Barak to rebuild. Torah, firstly. He said that he was going to build 18 yeshivas to make up for the 18 yeshivas in Lithuania that were lost. But as much as he expended for yeshivas, he expended for orphans who came from war-torn Europe.
I remember hearing a story, I mean, you probably know it, that the Chazon Ish sent someone to see the Ponovicherov, and this messenger found him in a room full of mattresses, and the Ponovicherov was lying down on a mattress, and then he was moving to the next one, and then he was moving to the next one, and the person asked him, is everything okay? What are you doing? And the Ponovicherov replied, they're orphans coming to use these mattresses. I just had to make sure that they're comfortable enough for them. Remarkable.
His feeling for these orphans, there's a story that I actually hadn't heard that, but I'll tell you another story. There was once a meeting to raise much-needed funds for his Bote Ovois, which is the name he gave to the orphanage. He refused to call it Bote Yesomim, an orphanage, to raise the self-respect of the orphans. And one of the people around the table said, well, why don't we get each donor to sponsor a bed with a plaque above the bed? And the Ponovicherov was beside himself when he heard the idea. He said, no way. You want a child who is an orphan to wake up and think that even the bed he's in isn't his.
So that's the real fundraisers of yesteryear. I'm sure there are many around still today. It's almost impossible to be very successful, as we can see, if you don't feel the plight of the people you listen to. You don't actually feel it.
Yep. And then there is a very famous story, possibly the most famous story about the Ponovicherov. He was, I believe, in South Africa, and he met a wealthy Jew who was far removed from Judaism. And the Jew said, I'll give you money on one condition, that the institution that you build with it will not have any of its students wear a yarmulke, a kippah. And the Ponovicherov took the money without batting an eyelid and opened a religious girls' school, a Beis Yaakov. And, he died in 1969, and as you said, as you described, he transformed the world. He transformed definitely the whole of Bnei Barak. It was a vision that he had at a time just after the Holocaust, during the Holocaust, when the Jewish people seemed to have no future, but he was somebody who never gave up.
Apparently when he came to the mountain where Ponovich is currently on, and the person he was with, I can't remember who, and he said this will be the largest yeshiva in the world. And they all felt he should possibly go to psychiatrist because he's lost his mind and he's, suffering so badly.
Yeah, they said, you're dreaming. And he said, I am dreaming, but I'm in
my eyes are wide open.
Yes, yeah. Now, you hear his legendary stories and you think that fundraising was easy for him. So, firstly, Shmuley Levison told me that the Ponovicherov hated fundraising. When he knocked on somebody's door, he prayed that the person not answer and not be in. And his older brother, Levi Levison, told me that in the 1950s, when the Ponovicherov possibly for the first time came to London to fundraise, he was here for 2 weeks. And in that 2 weeks, he didn't even cover the expense of his ticket. And he was never daunted by circumstances. He had unbelievable strength of faith and a feeling that he had to help. And he had very strong principles regarding fundraising. Rav Nachum Cohen, as a young bocher of 15, remembers that the Ponevezher Rov gave Shir Psicha on the first day of the Shiva. In the middle of the hall, there was a stender set up, and all the bochrim crowded round to hear. In the middle of the shir, a taxi driver walks into the yeshiva. He sort of elbows his way through the crowd, and he comes up to the Ponevezher Rov, and he says something to the Rov, who responded, "Tell him to wait. In half an hour I'll finish the shir, and I'll come then." So the driver goes, and he comes back, and he says he doesn't have time. If the Rov doesn't come now, he'll leave. The Ponevezher Rov thought about this for a moment and said, "Okay, let him leave." That night, the Ponevezher Rov said a shir to the older bochrim. And Rabbi Tzvi Drabkin, who's today the Rosh Yeshiva in Grodno, told over the explanation. The Rov told the bochrim, "Yesterday, Rav Moshe Portman, our Manal, told me that the yeshiva has enough food for one more day, and none of the shops will extend credit for more ingredients. We need to feed the bochrim, but what can we do in one day?" So the Ponevezher Rov called a very good friend, Rav Nochem Gnachowski, and told him, "We've got no food." He's a trial lawyer, and he told me he's very busy with the court case and he couldn't come over to help, but he had some good news, because a friend from America had come to Eretz Yisrael with $5,000 to distribute to tzedakah. This is back in the day. And this friend asked him for a list of needy people and institutions, and Rav Nochem told him to put Ponovich at the top of his list. And the man in the taxi was that Jew from America, sent to help the yeshiva, which is in a precarious position. And the driver has told him, passengers in a rush, he can't wait. And the Ponevezher Rov makes the following calculation. Yes, the bochrim need to eat, and no doubt this donor has funds, and the shir can be continued later in the day. But then, said the Rov, I felt that this is an opportunity to show the bochrim that nothing is more important than Torah. And in the end, the passenger was sort of taken by the Rov's authenticity. He waited. He gave the yeshiva enough money to feed the bochrim for 2 months. That wasn't the end of the story, because after his contribution, the donor asked the Rov a favor. He'd had sort of an illustrious grandfather, a Torah scholar, Talmud Chochem, and he would donate money to upgrade the yeshiva, but he wanted a picture of his grandfather to hang there, and it was there for several years, this painting, this picture. And in fact, the only time he took a break from fundraising was during the Yarchei Kala, which he founded to run on an annual basis, because he felt it was crucial for Balabatim to be more than just supporters of Torah. They needed to taste it properly. And he founded Ohel Kadoshim, which was to house a memorial to all Lithuanian kehillos which had been destroyed. Bearing in mind, by the way, that after the Holocaust, there were probably less than a dozen shtot rabbonim, rabbis of town communities, left alive in Lithuania and Latvia out of almost 700. And he built a building, and it stood next door to the yeshiva, but for 30 years the project was left unfinished because he used any money that he got for education. He felt it's far more important than building Holocaust memorials was to build a future, which is the opposite of the attitude of many large Jewish institutions, especially, 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And he explained that when the daughter of Pari stretched out her hand in the Nile, beginning of Shmos, to reach the basket that Moshe Rabbeinu was in, even though it was impossible from that distance, but when a Jew is drowning, you stretch out your hand to reach them, irrespective if you feel you're going to be able to or not. And Balei Tzedakah and heads of institutions will tell you that when it's done l'shem Shemayim, that miracles do indeed happen. And we now come to our final one, 1946, in the aftermath of World War II. American Jewry created a fundraising campaign. The first step was that 1,500 Jewish philanthropic leaders got together in Atlantic City to decide whether this goal was insane, because the goal was for $100 million. In today's world, 20 times that amount, that's $2 billion. And you had 2 days of arguments backwards and forwards whether this is just an idea that's never going to run. They went for it. At the launch campaign, several hundred Jews are invited. No one is allowed to give a donation less than $10,000, which is $200,000. They called each name aloud, and that person then had to pledge. There were men there, even women there. And then they went coast to coast to Danville, Virginia, to South Bend, to St. Paul. In North Carolina, a group of Christian leaders pledged to match the Jews dollar for dollar during a 10-day fundraising campaign. So this is the first charity extra. And they made it, which is an amazing outcome, unprecedented, except for the Mishkan, right? The Mishkan in the Midbar there, that was the largest fundraiser of all time. And they made it known that to assure this goal of $100 million, every contributor was told that their gift in 1946 is a one-off, and it's not going to be used for comparison in any future year. Although it has to be said, unfortunately, little of it went to any religious causes for refugees in DP camps. But no sooner was the campaign over than Mrs. Levy, who was the general chairman of the New York branch, said, "Does any of you feel any poorer because of the gift that you gave?" And therefore, as soon as this campaign ended, on December 1st, 1946, they decided to launch the next campaign, but this time not for 100 million, but for 170 million.
Where was this money intended for?
We'll get there in a moment. For the 250,000 refugees in the DP camps, that was one of the main addresses. For those generally who were still in Europe after the war, and for the Jews of Palestine. There were, for instance, 1,000 Jews each week fleeing Romania because of renewed anti-Semitism. So there was a very real need for this campaign. This wasn't, to, do up a street or a shul or whatever. This was pikuach nefesh. It was really something that was necessary. And President Truman, Eisenhower was involved. The donors included IBM. We'll come back to that. And the chairman of the appeal was Henry Morgenthau, who went on to demonstrate his complete commitment very dramatically in early March. He chartered planes which flew while storms grounded commercial airlines. He visited 7 cities in 7 days, talking the 1940s, remember. 1 month later, in the midst of sleet and snow and heavy ice, which was in fact so severe that his pilot lost his CAA license for a prohibited landing. And then Morgenthau visited another 5 cities at that time in 3 days.
But I don't understand. How did American Jewry respond to this extent to the appeal? I mean, even pikuach nefesh, this is staggering amounts.
Yes. Actually, I would perhaps ask the question differently, which is part of your earlier comment about, what was it being used for? If the money was there in America, and clearly it was, why wasn't it used during the Second World War to save Jews in Europe? And really, yes, really the second question answers the first. The Jews of America gave this money in guilt. It came about by a realization of what could have been done, should have been done for the Jews of Europe when there were very few people fundraising, with the exception of the Vadat almost, run by Rabbi Aaron Kotler and Rabbi Avram Kalmanovitz. And we'll come back to this particular point in a few months' time. But establishment Jewry in the United States of America abandoned the Jews of Europe during the war. And now was payback time. And going back, therefore, to the idea that one of the big donations came from IBM, blood money. We've previously spoken about IBM and the technology that they made, which was used by the Nazis during the war. This was a way of deflecting any questions. And associated with this is another important point. What made Henry Morgenthau an assimilated Jew who had not publicly made any Jewish statements during the war into identifying with Europe's Jews, the fundraiser for the Jewish people? The answer to that is similar. It's a series of encounters during World War II between him on the one hand, and Irving Bunim, Rabbi Avram Kalmanovitz, and Rabbi Aaron Kotler on the other hand. Remember, he was, for a decade, he held the highest position ever held at that time by a Jew. He was the Secretary of State for the Treasury. And the first time the three of them came to see him, he is, somewhat distant. He didn't have anything to do with frum Jews, for sure not. And he sort of says to them, "Okay, gentlemen, what will it be?" And they had an issue, how they were going to bridge the gulf to explain European Jewry while the war was going on to someone whose American identity was all-defining. And Irving Bunim, who was the only one of the religious Jews there who could speak English, he could see, though, that the presence of these two Gedolim made an impression on Morgenthau. So he explained the greatness of his guests, and they then said to Morgenthau, translated by Irving Bunim, that the President, Roosevelt, is doing very little on behalf of the Jews. And basically, Roosevelt did nothing to save the Jews during the war. And they said, "We beg of you. You're the Secretary of the Treasury. Do something. We know you can't necessarily change government policy, but there's definitely something that you can do. Jewish lives are being lost every day." And Morgenthau was moved by this. And he picks up the phone to the Secretary of State, to Cordell Hull, and he asked for an appointment. And the Undersecretary said, "What is this about? What's the appointment about?" And when Morgenthau said to him, the Undersecretary said to him that Hull is unavailable. To which Morgenthau said, "Tell Mr. Hull, I am waiting for an answer. I want a meeting with the President regarding the Nazi murder of the Jews in Europe." So he gets a call back a few minutes later, and he's told that there are very delicate negotiations in progress, and the President doesn't wish to disturb them. And in the room, the three of them could see Morgenthau getting very agitated, and he said, and I quote, "Tell Hull that this is the first time in my service to the government that I have ever asked for a meeting due to a personal matter, one regarding my people. If I do not get the meeting as requested, my resignation will be on Mr. Roosevelt's desk in the morning." And, they're shocked how far he had gone. And this was the start of his relationship with the Vadat in particular, and the rescue of European Jewry. And there was another case at one point in April 1944. There were 240 Jews in Vittel, which is a Nazi detention camp in the south of France, who had passports issued by the Salvadorian government. And an informer told the Nazis that these people were using fake papers, and they were then selected by the Nazis. Word got out of the camp, and it made its way via Recher-Sternbuch in Switzerland to America. And again, Irving Bunim, Rav Kalmanovitz, and Rav Aaron Kotler meet with Morgenthau. They come into his office and he says, "I haven't got any time for you gentlemen now. I'm on my way out. I've got to catch a flight." And they tell him the problem. And he says, "I can't do anything. I'm the Treasury Secretary." And so Rav Avram Kalmanovitz says to him, 250 Jews will be sent to Auschwitz if you don't. So he says, what can I do? And he sort of remonstrated, and Rav Kalmanovitz gets more and more agitated as he sees he's getting nowhere, until he's ashen-faced, he topples over, and he fainted in Morgenthau's office at the thought of what was happening to those Jews. You mentioned the Ponovitch Rov, his heart going out to people, exactly the same here. And Morgenthau is so shocked, he cancels everything. He spent 4 hours working through the night to ensure that the State Department pressured El Salvador to ensure that the passports were accepted as valid. And these are the people who brought him to it. These were the people who were Moise Nefesh and taught him how far you go for others. And he then became the chairman of these campaigns. Now, we said 4, but it's going to be 4.5 in a way, because associated to these campaigns of 46 and 47 is something that takes place in 48. By January of 1948, the Jews of Palestine are already fighting their neighbouring Arabs before May. There are convoys of cars going up to Yerushalayim being ambushed. There are skirmishes breaking out all through the country. We have described this when we spoke about the history of Yishmael versus Yisrael. And Ben Gurion sent Golda Meir to the USA to raise funds from the American Jewish community. Now, the treasurer of the Jewish agency, Eliezer Kaplan, had made an earlier trip to raise $7 million, and he failed. She arrives in New York in the middle of the winter. And, this is a woman who'd come to New York in search of millions of dollars. She had in her purse that evening of her arrival one $10 bill. So the custom agents asked her how she intended to support herself in the USA. She said, "I've got family here." And she gets up to speak in Chicago with a cigarette in hand. And she speaks for 35 minutes. And she closed her speech with these words: "Don't be bitterly sorry 3 months from now for what you failed to do today." And when she left Chicago, she visited 19 other cities across the country, and she came back to Israel on March 19th with $50 million. They bought jeeps and guns and planes and ammunition in Czechoslovakia for the soldiers who were fighting desperately to create a Jewish state. By the way, $50 million was nearly twice the figure that Ben Gurion had set her to achieve, and 3 times the entire oil revenue of Saudi Arabia for 1947. Now, her speech, and it's relevant to where we stand at this moment in time, it could have been made any time in the past 12 months. I will quote just parts of it. "In Palestine, we are fighting to make this resolution of the United Nations a reality, not because we wanted to fight. If we had the choice, we would have chosen peace, to build in peace. Friends, we have no alternative in Palestine. The Mufti and his men have declared war upon us. We have to fight for our lives, for our safety. These young boys and girls, many in their teens, are bearing the burden of what is happening in the country with a spirit that no words can describe. I want to say to you, friends, that the Jewish community in Palestine is going to fight to the very end. If we have arms to fight with, we will fight with those, and if not, we will fight with stones in our hands. The issue is that if these 700,000 Jews in Palestine can remain alive, then the Jewish people as such is alive. If these 700,000 people are killed off, then for many centuries we are through with this dream of a Jewish people and a Jewish homeland. And every Jew in the country also knows that within a few months a Jewish state in Palestine will be established. The Mufti has the Arab states, not all so enthusiastic about helping him, but states with government budgets. The Egyptian government can vote a budget to aid our antagonists. The Syrian government can do the same. We have no government, but we have millions of Jews in diaspora. And exactly as we have faith in our youngsters in Palestine, I have faith in Jews in the United States. And I beg of you, don't be too late. Don't be bitterly sorry 3 months from now for what you have failed to do today. The time is now."
Well, it's almost quite freaky to listen to a repeat of history today, and we're experiencing it now. We're experiencing Israel fighting in a way for its survival and relying on international money for it. We are, Baruch Hashem, in a bit of a better position now with the American government helping. But you see from the start of Israel, and it's so recent, the miracles that we've relied on to take us up to this stage, and the miracles that we still rely on.
And you see us surrounded by enemies.
Nothing's changed.
Ça change, yes.
So, Rabbi Hirsch, that was your 4.5 to 5
yes.
episodes. Going back to halachic issues you mentioned at the beginning.
Yes, so cover a couple of those briefly. Diane Weiss asks the question, is it permissible when donations are being solicited from people, let's say in shul, to mention a far higher amount than you intend giving in order to get others to raise their donations? To which he says that this isn't something new. There's a Gemara in Sukkah. 4 things cause one's material wealth to diminish. And one of them is people who pledge publicly to give charity and they don't give it. And the Maharsha explains that they get out of giving a large amount because they claim they never intended to give so much, but much less. And therefore Diane Weiss says that's forbidden. Rav Zilberstein adds the following question. there was a wealthy potential donor who comes to Eretz Yisrael from America, and he enters a shul, and he asks for maftir because he has yahrzeit. So the shul look at it as a heaven-sent opportunity to sell him an aliyah, because they're going to bid for it, and they're going to push up the price, and then he'll pay much more than he would have done, and they'll make money off it. So that's what they do. And he figures this out. And he now wonders if he's obligated to pay for his bid. Did he make a vow to tzedakah by bidding? And Reb Chaim Kamenetsky said he doesn't have to pay anything at all, even if he took the aliyah, because it's genevas das, it is misleading. The only thing Reb Chaim adds is if he would have been prepared to give that amount to the shul anyway, then perhaps he should do so, but there's no obligation. I now want to share with the listeners a case that made its way all the way to Besdin. I'll keep the identifying details vague because it's less than 20 years old and I don't want anything to be identified, but every detail is as it happened. And this is a question about a communal tzedakah, which involved quite a bit of effort in a Besdin. There was an institution in a particular country, a Jewish institution, that had been lent $1.5 million by an individual from a different country. And the arrangement was that they would pay back first $500,000, which they did, and then the next $1 million. But when it came to paying back the larger part, they told the donor they don't have the money. So he said to them, but you've got assets. And they said, yes, but we don't really want to dispose of them, so we'll make you a deal. In other words, you could pursue us in Besdin, but it'll take a while till the summons and the court case and the psak. So instead of that, what we will do is we'll offer you $800,000 now, and in a year's time we'll pay you $100,000 more on condition that you forgive, that you're moichel the last $100,000. So he doesn't really have a choice, but he consults with a dayan back in his own country, who's actually a fan of the podcast. And this dayan says to him, issue a moidah, be moisa moidah in the dayan's own Besdin, that you only signed under duress, and actually you're not moichel any of the outstanding funds. So, fine, he does this. And now comes the payment date for that $100,000 which they agreed to pay, and they delay. So he takes them to Besdin, and when they're all sitting in Besdin, he says, actually, the case isn't $100,000 that I'm claiming, but $200,000 because I want the whole amount back. So, as you can imagine, the institution is shocked, and they said, you can't do that. And he goes backwards and forwards, and there's a 15-page psak written, which says he very much can do this. Now, there are circumstances where if you agree to waive it, you can't just issue a letter that says, I didn't mean it, but here it's forced upon him, and therefore it holds. Okay, so the institution says, okay, but in the interim, from the time you lent us the money until we now find ourselves in Besdin, there was a Shemitah year, and therefore all loans are cancelled, unless you wrote a prusbel. And he said, I did write a prusbel. So they say, okay, show it to us. So he goes back to his country to look for it, and he can't find it. However, the halacha is that someone who says that I wrote a prusbel and lost it is believed. So the institution says, but it wasn't your money you lent us, it was your mother's charitable fund. And since you only wrote a prusbel for yourself and not for her, the loan is cancelled. To which the dayanim said, that's not actually true. If somebody writes a prusbel, it covers the charitable funds. And anyway, it's doubtful whether you need to write a prusbel in the first place because it's not a case necessarily of an individual lending the money. So they awarded this guy the full $200,000 and it was all paid back.
I mean, the thing that stands out, to me at least, from that story is the fact that you mentioned that there's no identifying details in it, and yet you said the dayan listens to the podcast, which basically means dayanim all over the world are just addicted to the podcast. We cannot identify him.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva where he's asked, is there a prohibition or is it wrong to publicize the name of a donor to other institutions who need funds or to other poor people based on a posuk, Mevorech re'ehu b'kol godel b'boiker hashkem klolo techoshev loi. Somebody who blesses their friend in a loud voice, it's a curse. So Moshe says that's only if you're telling people who are empty-headed or nefarious about this donor, because then we're worried that they'll turn up as a sort of gang and take money from him. Whereas if you're telling people of good repute, we're not concerned. And even according to the sort of the second opinion in Rashi, where there is concern that many guests will suddenly come to this wealthy individual and he'll be too embarrassed not to be able to provide for them and he will end up overextending himself, that's only where the type of tzedakah is sort of food-based, hospitality-based, and he has to sort of deliver a product, and we are worried that he'll be too embarrassed to turn them away. Whereas here, he says, Lekker issa, there's no problem. Mishum de im yochel litein, tovu sheyetin. If he can give, he should give. Af im loy hoyonoisin beloizer. Even if without his name being publicized to other people, he would never have given tzedakah. That doesn't matter. V'im einu yochel liten, and if he can't give, we assume stam inche, the average individual, sheloi isbayesh miloy she'enu yochel, that he would not be embarrassed to say, actually, I can't afford to give you what you're asking. And he won't be pressured into going beyond his means. But if you know that this is that type of individual, then you wouldn't be allowed to reveal the name. Or if the donor says that you may not, then obviously you can't. Just by the way, Rav Moshe also has another interesting truth about tzedakah, about a woman who promised $1,000 to tzedakah if she would lose weight. And this is in 1955, so $1,000 was quite a lot of money.
$1 a gram. Yeah.
And he goes into exactly when she becomes liable. I will leave the readers to learn it. It's in the first volume of Yeridea. No, that's their homework.
Right, so just going to pivot to just a little anecdote. We met up with the CEO of Charity Extra, Yitzi Bude. For anyone who hasn't heard of him or his platform, charityextra.com is one of the most popular online fundraisers platforms in the world. The J. Lee and History for the Curious have been using his services for many years. He's a fantastic guy with a great team, with offices in Israel and the USA. He told us that he started the platform 5 years ago, and in that time they have helped raise £650 million for charities around the world. Prior to that, he was running a furniture business, manufacturing and importing, and he saw a way of ensuring that he could produce better results for charities. So he launched in October 2019, and then COVID hit, and online charity went berserk. But he always ensured that it remained affordable and cost-effective for the tzedakahs, and this campaign will also be with his platform, which we're very much looking forward to.
Yes, in fact, we asked him about, it's a constant weekly demand nowadays, these campaigns. Is it not becoming too repetitive? And Yitzi said to us, initially he got pushback, people saying it won't work, but people are now used to it and they are able to set their own parameters. And if they don't want to donate, they won't. They can say no, which is very similar to what Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote decades beforehand. He also said that the most powerful outcome is that it has changed giving. Because until then, charities had more or less relied on a select few wealthy donors, and they rarely pursued those who were giving, £36 or $50, because there was no cost-efficient way to do it. There was no opportunity to reach out. And equally, there were those who wanted to give to a charity. They can't afford the $500 dinner price tag, so how are they going to help? And Charity Extra was the democratization of giving, because everyone makes a difference.
And we've seen, like the story you mentioned earlier about the 1,500 people packed in the room. That was the only option available. Yeah. And in the last 70, 80 years, the world's seen enough crises in the Jews in Ukraine, in Israel now, and everyone can give $10. Everyone can feel a part of it.
In fact, he said in particular, the age groups of people in their 30s and 40s have given much more as a result. And we asked him sort of on the spot to share a powerful moment in Charity Extra's history. And he told us of a school that ran a campaign, and one child gave his entire savings, his pocket money of £12, because he wanted his teacher's page and the school to succeed, which was very moving for the school and for him. And his proudest point was a charity that was dealing with elderly disabled people, which was going to close down. and as a result of the campaign, they had enough funds to keep on going, and they're still going to this day.
Yep, I highly recommend any of our listeners who are planning to do a online fundraiser to reach out to his very friendly team. It just comes to mind a story I heard recently about Rabbi Yaakov Galinsky. He told Rabbi Schachter what happened to him on a fundraising mission. The homeowner opened the door and told him they were in the middle of a Sheva Brachos, but perhaps the rabbi would like to come in as a surprise speaker. I mean, if you've come here anyway, and would you mind waiting in the back on the on the patio there? I'll call you soon. But the problem was that the area was quite poorly lit, and the host neglected to inform the rabbi about his backyard swimming pool. The splash was very loud, and to compensate for this terribly embarrassing moment, then the man offered a very large donation, and Reb Galinsky was very well known for his sharp wit and humour, asked him if he could fall in the pool for a second time. It's a very cute story to end off. So to all our listeners, it's thank Rabbi Hirsch firstly for a brilliant episode, and we have plans to increase the podcast immensely. We want to reach many more people. We get daily emails, I just discovered this podcast and now I have 139 podcasts to catch up on, and I have to wait for my flights and holidays, and we see clearly that although we think we've reached many people, then the world is big and there's many more people to reach. And just as a little bonus, any donation over $100 on our page, or that would be £80, and the other countries can do their own currency exchanges. But any donation over $100 will be mentioned by name on the podcast. We are happy to list out as many names as we possibly can, although maybe not in one breath. And all of these donations will be put in a raffle, and the winner, as Rabbi Hirsch said before, will get to introduce one of the podcasts. So if you're based in London, that will be easy. If abroad, there is marvelous technology that will enable us to do so. Rabbi Hirsch, when will the draw be?
Probably around the 15th of November, Mitzvah Shem.
So I know you've all dreamt of introducing this podcast. For the opportunity to do so and to help a fantastic cause, please, it'll be lovely to see your name with a donation on the page to help this podcast continue. Thank you, Rabbi Hirsch. Have a good night, and we'll see you next week. The link to donate will be live on Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night, the 2nd of November. The link is charityextra.com/JLE/podcast, and you'll see it in the description below. Thank you very much.